Welcome everyone to a new episode of The Briefing. Today we're discussing transitional justice in Syria. In the popular imagination, evil often announces itself. It arrives with a snarl, a uniform, a theatrical cruelty that separates the perpetrator from the rest of us. The idea is comforting because it allows societies to believe mass violence is carried out by monsters, not by men with offices, families, ambitions, fears, and paperwork. But the history of atrocity repeatedly unsettles that comfort. Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil, not because the crimes were banal, but because those who carried them out could be disturbingly ordinary, just your average people. They were functionaries, careerists, loyalists, cowards who learned to make obedience feel like duty, and cruelty feel like your average admin. Jack Hay's work on the psychology of Nazi war criminals, especially the Nazi and the psychiatrist, returns us to the unnerving question. When psychiatrist Douglas Kelly examined senior Nazi prisoners before Nuremberg, he searched for some obvious abnormality that might explain how men helped organize industrial-scale murder. But what he found was more disturbing. Intelligent people, ambitious people, vain people, and an almost total capacity to disconnect their action from their consciousness. As Syria embarked last month on a journey to try war criminals of the Assad era, this is the frame through which Syria's accountability moment should be understood. The recent trials have placed figures from the former regime, including Atef Najib of the Daraa fame, in the dock over allegations linked to torture, repression, and the violence that helped ignite the 2011 uprising. Najib, the former political security chief in Daraa and cousin of Bashar al-Assad, has long been accused of overseeing the detention and abuse of children, whose anti-Assad graffiti became one of the sparks of that revolution. Yet Syria's reckoning cannot stop with a few notorious names. It must ask how the extraordinary cruelty of the past 4 decades, which predate Bashar al-Assad, by the way, came to be and were enabled and normalized. What kind of system produced such men? What kind of justice can dismantle the habits of obedience, impunity, dehumanization that made their crimes possible in the first place? In this episode, we will discuss all these questions and more, and whether the current approach to transitional justice in Damascus can fulfill justice indeed for Syria's victims and future generations. I am joined in this episode with Andrea Liotti, investigative editor of The New Arab, and Amr Salahi, senior journalist in the news desk. Thank you both for joining us. I would like to begin with you today, Amr, if I may, just if you can recap for us the trials, when they started, who's in the dock, and what to expect in the next few days and weeks.
Okay. Well, the trials began on April the 26th. They were accompanied by some emotional scenes. People outside were waiting for the trial of Atef Najib to begin. The mothers of children who were tortured or who lost their lives, they were in tears outside. Nobody could imagine a scene like this in Syria 2 years ago. At the same time, there's some serious questions about the credibility of the trial. Syria doesn't have a transitional justice law. This is the main issue.
So there is this kind of origin story of the Syrian revolution that anyone who's followed the Syria story from 2011 knows. Perhaps it's worth just recapping that story for our viewers, because this is the main villain of that story, Atef Najib, correct? And there is some symbolism behind his starting with him.
Yes.
Precisely.
Atef Najib...
allegedly.
He led the political security branch in Daraa, and he was in that position for a few years before.
So as the Arab Spring wave of uprising was sweeping through the region, there was that famous slogan in the region, "Al-Sha'b yurid isqat al-nizam," the people want the downfall of the regime.
Yeah.
Syria was not the first theater of the Arab Spring. It had already started in Tunisia, spread to Egypt and Libya, if I'm correct, before Syria. And then it arrived in Syria on the walls of Daraa, correct?
Yeah.
With graffiti by schoolchildren. Is that what happened?
Yes, this is what most accounts say happened. The children wrote on walls. They wrote the slogan you mentioned, "The people demand the fall of the regime." Some children also wrote "Your turn doctor in a reference to Bashar al-Assad, because Bashar al-Assad was, of course, a doctor of ophthalmology. And they were arrested, apparently under Atef Najib's orders, even though he denies this. And they were tortured. Some reportedly had their nails pulled out. When their families asked about them, they were told to go away. And reportedly, this is anecdotal, we're not sure about it. Reportedly, the security officers who met them told them, go away and make more children, forget about these. And if you can't make more children, we'll go and visit your wives.
And in a conservative tribal or has tribal population,
yes.
A region like Daraa, that is an insult. That is a grave insult. It is not just a...
Yes, that was a very big insult, and it angered the families, and it led to more protests, which led to more repression. And like in the other Arab countries, the uprisings grew, and more protests took place in several Syrian cities in solidarity with Daraa. From Daraa, the protests spread to Homs. And they were met with violent repression for several months.
And using the Air Force as well, correct?
Yeah, I think the Air Force came after the Syrian uprising was militarized, and the first Free Syrian Army units were formed.
That's a history we all followed day by day from 2011. And like you said, no one would have imagined that these villains would be in the dock today. Can you tell us when he was arrested and where?
Atef Najib was arrested in January 2025, apparently, I think in Daraa province.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Other people who are associated with the regime have also been arrested, and they're awaiting trial. They don't seem to have appeared in the dock. There's Mohammed al-Shar, the former interior minister, who gave himself up in February 2025. There's also Ibrahim Haweja, who was the head of the Air Force intelligence. Now, he was captured in March 2025 when Assadist elements launched an uprising against the current government, which of course ended in massacres of
the coastal massacres
civilians.
in the Latakia coast.
Yeah.
So these are the people in the dock that are not in absentia. There are also people who are being tried in absentia, correct?
Yeah.
Like the Bashar al-Assad himself and his brother Maher. How many of these are in absentia and how many are in actual custody?
Well, there are different reports about who exactly will be going on trial, but the main figures are in absentia are Bashar and Maher al-Assad, and one of their cousins, Wasim al-Assad. I don't think all the suspects have been announced.
Right, so this is the first round of trials, if you like. Which court is trying them? Is it? I read they did not set a special tribunal for this process. They are operating within Syrian criminal law.
They're being tried at the Palace of Justice in Damascus by the 4th Criminal Court. When it comes to under which law, it's a little complicated because Syria doesn't have a transitional justice law. And it seems to be, and they seem to be being tried under war crimes laws in international treaties. Some of them, Syria is not even a party to these. So this is where it gets a little confusing and legally questionable.
This is a good segue to ask Andrea about, so there's been a lot of criticism of this process because of these elements. Do you feel like this is fit for purpose, this approach? Does it meet the standards of transitional justice as we've seen in other contexts in your view?
Well, no, as outlined by Amr, that Syria has no such a thing as a body of laws that would be fit for purpose to deal with transitional justice, with war crimes as they're understood, or crimes against humanity in the international, mostly Western framework of international law. And this has been highlighted. I mean, what they're using is a patchwork of like existing military and civil codes, not only for the Assad era regime officials, but also for, we mentioned before, the violence and what's happening on the massacres perpetrated against Alawi civilians on the coast last year. This is what lawyers have been saying. I mean, the country is not yet at a stage where you have done like a substantial legal reform of the legal system. So part of the criticism is like, how are you doing it more for the international community, for the spectacles, or to show that
Let's
you're
get into that
accountable?
in a little bit, actually, the politics behind it. But in terms of the legal process, you mentioned something important, which are the post-Assad crimes that occurred, some of which could meet the threshold of war crimes. Some could be sectarian violence, but others could meet that threshold. And correct me if I'm wrong, they have not been included in this process.
No.
So the process explicitly chose only to focus on a certain time frame.
On Assad regime era, so like it's as if like transitional justice ended on December the 8th when with the collapse of the Assad regime. So of course legal scholars and civil society organizations, a big proportion of the Syrian civil society is saying, well, no, we are still going through the transition, right? So the kind of crimes that have been committed since the collapse, the overthrow of the Assad regime are part of transitional justice, because if you look at what happened on the coast in March 2025, what happened in Ceuta in the summer, in July, much of it can be framed as a retaliation for the crimes committed on an arbitrary basis for what's happened under the Assad regime, and how certain crimes committed by the Assad regime were associated with certain communities. And this, we can open a Pandora box of discussing how dictatorship manipulates like sort of sectarian allegiances.
In the case of the coast, because of the whole Alawi community, and that was the community of the Assad clan, that could have been framed, or that was framed as retaliation. And a lot of perpetrators did kind of mention that, or made comments about this being a vendetta or teaching a lesson. Now, and we're not going to get into all of that history, obviously, the sectarian angle here. But then the other massacres that occurred, for example, in Suwaida, cannot be framed strongly as such in the same manner, because the Suwaida province sat out the revolution and was not fully embedded in the structure of the Assad regime. So in that case, what is happening is sectarian violence, but also it can be linked to the transitional justice, because what you just said about the regime using different tactics, divide and conquer, to rule over Syria, it was part of its toolkit to engineer these social divisions. Then the revolution, obviously, at some point took a sectarian angle. Can you tell us here a little bit how that relates to transitional justice? Like, why is it important to get it right to prevent that? There is a link usually in scholarship between getting it right, getting a good process of transitional justice, not trying some figureheads, and preventing this cycle. It's not just a matter of doing things by the book as such.
Yeah. I think the purpose, in principle, that we can look at, I mean, I think there are a few instances, probably no instance where it worked out smoothly, but in principle, you're looking at reconciling society, move forward and introduce certain mechanisms of deterrence so that this won't happen anymore. So exactly what happened last year is what should not happen now in Syria, now that Assad is gone. There should not be like massacres and retaliation against certain communities. So one thing is to put on trial Assad regime officials, and there's no doubt that the main perpetrator was the Assad regime over the past 50 years, if you go back to his father. But it's not going to be enough to put on trials the officials that you're pursuing. And scholarship would argue, you can set an example of institutional reform and accountability for the perpetrators of atrocities, but then you have another process that is like is that can this be qualified as impartial, pure justice? Many scholars have been argued this doesn't even exist because the whole process will be politicized. Of course, those who are putting on trial regime officials are those who won the war, like those who seize control of Damascus and the rest of the country through weapons.
Which often happens in these contexts. There will be a victor. The victor will institute justice and
same as after World War II, because we started with Hannah Arendt. There's no doubt.
But even then, so sorry to interrupt you. It is there is a threshold probably that the other contexts may have met, and that this approach is not meeting, like a minimum base. Would you think that's a fair comment?
It's a difficult one to. I think because some of the we should talk at some point about how victims, or even the families of the victims, are not part of this process. And much of it is a top-down approach, and that's why this is a core component of transitional justice that is not there. The Damascus government is they're doing what they're doing. They're putting regime officials on trial, but there's no consultation with families that are like civil society organizations who sign letters like saying, well, this is happening without us being consulted of the process. So this is something that's missing there. Now, I've been read like with the limited readings I've done on the subject in terms of scholars and academic literature. I think we should be realistic also about what to expect, because the premise that, if the UN was involved or if they were doing these trials in Hague, that would be no more neutral and it would be fairer. If you look at what happened in the Balkans, that's not how it went. It was perceived itself as a politicized tool to do justice, mostly against certain perpetrators. In this case, like is mostly, in that case, it was mostly the Serbian component.
Is that because of NATO and the position of
and the politics of the there's no way they were gonna they were gonna pursue justice in a neutral, unbiased way. They were also trying to deliver. They were trying to hold perpetrators accountable, but there was still an agenda there, an international agenda. So even in the trials happening in Syria, I think we have to be realistic that the Bashar government or the current authorities are not going to.
That's a fair point. So we cannot hold them to a standard higher than other
even
contexts.
What has happened
they
before.
Are doing some process. There are pros and cons, but even then, even by the metric of the Syrian civil society and the victims, there is a threshold they're not meeting. So
Definitely.
While we cannot expect them to be perfect and like a fictional film, Plato's Republic or something, there is a threshold that they are not meeting, and that could be improved on. I will get back to that point.
Inclusion of the victims' families.
I will want to get back to that point in detail, but I want to go back to Amr for the history a little bit. So, because you mentioned the excellent point that this predates Bashar al-Assad, that from Hafez's time, this is a multi-decade issue. It doesn't start with a revolution. There is a bit of a history here, and that history, the baggage from that history is that the divisions in society, the wounds, the trauma, the rifts are so profound that the process has to be, the process of transitional justice has to meet those high standards in order to heal all of that and move forward. In the context of a country like Lebanon post-civil war, the process was transitional amnesia. There was no justice of any kind. It was everyone on day one of Ta'if agreement forgot everything. That's it. We're going to collectively forget and pretend we like each other. And that has repeated the cycle in Lebanon or kept the civil war simmering under like a simmering temperature, not a boiling temperature. That does flare from time to time. I want to though visit the history of the repression and violations in Syria, because this starts with Bashar's father. Not even, I mean, we could also go back to the previous path before him, but he, correct me if I'm wrong, and you probably know this history better than I do, is that he was the one who built an industrial scale repression state, full of like a total conveyor belt system of mass incarceration, mass graves, disappearances, torture. He even invited the expertise of ex-Nazi officials.
I'm not sure if Hafiz al-Assad actually was the one who originated this system of repression, or if it was the regime which predated him, the 1963 to 1970 Ba'ath regime. But certainly it's, the people have commented before on how refined or developed the torture methods in Syria were compared to Arab countries, and how cruel they could be, and how Syria has became a much more mass surveillance state where people were afraid to open their mouths about anything, especially if you compare it to countries like Egypt.
Would you say the so in political science, to define a totalitarian regime, there are 6 criteria. I don't need to list them here, but would you say the Syrian regime met most of the criteria, not just to be a dictatorship, but a totalitarian regime where the thoughts themselves were you start with policing at the level of thoughts?
Well, it's quite debatable whether it reached the levels of Stalin's or Hitler's regimes, but it certainly had some of the characteristics where people believed that spies were everywhere, that they couldn't even privately say anything critical of the government. Although I suppose it differs from, for example, communist regimes, where in that the regime didn't really demand any kind of ideological loyalty, just silence from the population, with a strong message that if you do anything out of line, there will be severe consequences.
While Ba'ath ideology was taught at schools and
yes,
however, and the population and the bureaucracy were indoctrinated into the ideology, if not the mass, not the entire all of society, but I guess teachers, bureaucrats, and so on had to be Baathified in a way. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes. I mean, of course, there were. I mean, Ba'ath ideology was taught in schools. You had demonstrations of support, like these rallies and so on. But at the same time, I don't think they reached the level of more totalitarian societies in that they infiltrated into every aspect of life. It was possible to kind of get by and ignore that stuff.
Maybe they were not efficient or very good at it. Maybe, but not for lack of trying necessarily. I think the tactic of the Assad regime, because it was a family dynasty and a clan, that it mixed these elements. They imported some elements of Stalinism, but really also ruled in the way a clan would rule, putting relatives, like Stalin didn't put his cousins, and correct me if I'm wrong. So all echelons of power, the highest would be Bashar's cousins, nephews, trusted people from his village, similar to Saddam and Tikrit, and it's kind of like a hybrid system of dynasty, clan, and elements of that modern totalitarianism. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yes, I mean that family element was definitely there, and of course, Hafiz al-Assad was succeeded by his son, and at one point he appointed his brother as vice president, and all his cousins were occupied top posts and so on, and they were beyond any kind of accountability from the law or any other element of society. And someone like Atef Najib, who's on trial now, for example, used to call himself, I think, the god of Daraa. So
I think arguably the Syrian regime there's often this critical point, like why so much effort has been spent by Arab commentators on criticizing the Syrian regime, but not other Arab regimes. Of course, all Arab regimes are repressive dictatorships, with the exception of a handful. But there is something, to me, it appears there's something unique and different about these two Ba'ath regimes, the Assad regime and Saddam's regime, and the extent and scale of repression and the extent of social wounds that they've inflicted. And in the Iraq case, they've genocided the Kurds. They've done anti-Shia. They've done denaturalization, deportation of people who've been there. In the case of Syria, prior to the revolution, you had the mass incarceration inside Naya, tens of thousands of people, and then during the revolution,
I think that is the answer. I mean, these were both genocidal regimes. Assad, during the Syrian conflict, he was often accused of trying to re-engineer Syria's demographics. Whole towns and parts of cities were destroyed. The casualty figures, usually 500,000 is given from the Syrian
and that's an undercount.
Civil war, and it is probably an undercount. Prior to 2011, you had the Hama massacre, which practically reshaped the city of Hama and may have killed as many as 30,000 people. In other Arab countries, you do get repression. You do get things like, for example, in Egypt, the Rabaa massacre. You also get torture there. You get people dying of medical neglect. It's not quite on the same scale.
I think the comparison, we don't want to compare for the sake of, it's not a competition in the sense, but
of course,
the comparison here, I think the purpose of it is to highlight the need for transitional justice in a way that there should be transitional justice in all of these contexts, in every single Arab country, once, their systems are changed into something more has legitimacy and popular consent. But particularly Syria needs a correct, a sound, legitimate process of transitional justice, regardless of whether it meets a theoretical framework in Western scholarship which is not the point, but the point is the popular legitimacy it will create and the healing effect it would have. And it sounds to me from what we've said so far is that the current approach, it doesn't meet that standard. It's first of all, the court is not the correct court. The law is not the right law. The process is not the right process. Maybe this is where we need to discuss a little bit about the process. So, if we were advising now that process, what's the first, and maybe Andrea, you would answer this, what would be the first step towards correcting course and to achieve transitional justice? As journalists, as reporters, as people who follow other contexts, what would be the main thing that they're not doing that they should start and ensure?
Well, one aspect we haven't touched on is the separation of powers. One of the legacy of the Assad regime was that the judiciary was under control of the executive. This has not changed with the provisional constitution that was approved last year. The presidency still retain large control and leverage over the judiciary. So this is still happening. The current trials are happening with the Syrian government having more influence than it should have over the
And the judge
proceedings.
himself is from the Idlib inner circle. Perhaps you can tell us a bit about the judge.
This I wouldn't be able to comment on that, but I think it's highly symbolic that, of course, they chose someone who's from Idlib and someone who was prosecuted.
What's his name?
Who was forced to Aryan, right?
He's called Fakhruddin Aryan, and he defected from the Assad regime in 2013. He worked later on under the Syrian interim government, which was a now defunct Syrian opposition government in Idlib's Civil Court of Appeal. And there is, as Andre mentioned, quite a lot of symbolism in that a man who was once sentenced to death for defecting from the Assad regime is now judging these Assad regime figures. But that's only a symbolic thing. I mean, the issues which need to be looked at are much deeper.
Apart from that separation of the courts, so we would do that first. We would create a judiciary that's a necessary step to ensure independence, transparency, fair trial, etc.
It wouldn't ensure anyway, as we discussed historically, it wouldn't be a depoliticized trial anyway, but it would be, of course, helpful. If I can maybe comment on something that is relevant to what happened in Hama, because we mentioned it in the 80s, and one of the worst massacres ever committed by the Hafez al-Assad regime, where they wiped out basically a large component of a city on its own population. One of the main perpetrators of that massacre, Rifat al-Assad, went then in exile, and who was the head of the Sarayat al-Difa, so he was a very high-ranking, or other than a relative of the Assad.
And that's Hafez's brother, Rifat.
Yeah. He was in exile in Switzerland. They tried to prosecute him for many years. He was able then to flee to the Emirates, and he died there without ever facing any justice for what he did. Why is important? Because all of this process of transitional justice is reliant in the end on the compliance of the international community or external powers to extradite. For example, we're talking about Maher al-Assad or Bashar al-Assad. Who's going to get them in Russia? That's the point. I mean, this is one of the main, for those who are not in Syria, you are it depends on whether other external powers are compliant, and if they place any trust in the current framework of international law as we understand it. And I'll question this further, because if we have the Trump administration in the U.S. that is imposing sanctions on the International Criminal Court because they issued arrest warrants against Israeli officials. So you are in a framework where some of even those who have been upholding traditionally, in the rule of law, the U.S. or from a Western democratic perspective, they're acting as rogue states and saying that basically international law can be applied only when it doesn't affect their own allies.
When it's convenient or safe against, cartoonish dictators that no one cares about. But when it's anyone who has value to anybody, that will buy them impunity. In the case of Rifat, he had billions. I don't know, he managed to smuggle billions of dollars out of Syria. And he created a media network, and he was in Paris or
he lived in Switzerland, I think also in Paris, if I'm not mistaken.
Because he defected, they welcomed him. And similar to other Assad regime figures who defected, they were just given a blank slate.
Abdel Halim Khaddam, the vice president, was in Paris.
And that wipes the slate clean, and that's it. You're innocent now. That's an important point. But I do want to go back to the one about civil society, because, so step one, the judiciary, the laws need to have a framework to deal with something this momentous. The courts themselves need to have independence and not be subject to politicization, which we will talk a little bit about politicization in a bit. But then the civil society, from what I understand from background research and our discussions earlier, is that the victims themselves are not part of this process. Yeah. The civil society, the very rich and competent Syrian civil society, who's spent the last decade or more archiving war crimes, gained expertise in documenting it and prosecution even. I think there are multiple bodies, some with, I think, UN linkages involving Syria and UN for war crimes. And from what I understand is they're not being consulted or included in this process whatsoever. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I think, as discussed, it's the matter is we should question whether this is a process that Syrian authorities are doing for an international audience or for an internal one. If they are doing it for an international audience for the purpose of lifting sanctions, unlocking funds for reconstruction, showing their Western allies mostly that, we've been serious about this. Look, we're putting on trial Assad-era officials. Fine. And for the spectacles, they're doing a good job. If it's about including Syrian civil society and having them being part of this process and having the families of the victims involved and consulted and put an end to their marginalization as well. Because, of course, under the Assad regime, these were like families that were marginalized. They couldn't speak about what was happening. So if, as I said, like if last year they established the National Commission for Transitional Justice, and as the outcome of that, you have a signed declaration with 21 Syrian civil society organizations, including lawyers, saying, well, that's not how it should be done. Like this, you first of all, you should consult the victims, those who are primarily affected, for which you should seek reparation, and with whom you should consult.
So what is this national body doing if it's not involved in these trials?
Well, that's the big question. I mean, and we're saying, the impression that many observers have of how this process is unfolding is that it's rushed through. And it was the same impression actually for, even the Coast massacres and what we briefly discussed, because they put
those trials were also rushed
through, like some low-ranking individuals on trials that to show that they're doing something. This is, of course, like much bigger. You're talking about Assad regime officials, a structure that's been there for 50 years and more. Like,
I think, Amr, your sources told you that something similar, that they were not being used.
Yes,
professionals.
I spoke to a human rights investigator who said that there's a lot of capacity among Syrian society, and Syrians have even gone to other countries like Ukraine, like South Korea, to train activists within this field in documenting crimes and so on. And they had documented crimes in Syria, but they seem to be outside the judicial process for a start. The other thing is, if you're going to look at war crimes and investigate evidence, you need to preserve it. And many of the war crime sites haven't been adequately preserved. The investigator told me that even in Tadamun, there's people have made social media videos where they've taken out bones of people and held them up to the camera, these sites aren't being cordoned off, they're not being protected, they're not being analyzed. So this is, in terms of evidence gathering and forensics, there seems to be a big issue.
That's interesting. This Tadamun massacre was recently in the news because they captured the main culprit or alleged culprit, Amjad Youssef, and he was interrogated on TV by one of the ministers, and that was put on social media. So there is a bit of a performative kind of aspect to this. Would you say?
Well, you could argue that, and of course, these kind of TV confessions or interrogations, they're not in line with due process and fair trials and justice and so on.
I want to talk a little bit about the politics, because we talked about politicization. So you said they rushed through. You're saying there is inadequate kind of. We can't really judge whether it's through a lack of competence or the same issue here happening is they're not taking it as seriously as they should be. But whatever the outcome is the same, there is a feeling that things are rushed through, they're not done properly, they're not consultative, and therefore that could endanger transitional justice, that could delay any aspect of healing or preventing the cycle of violence. A lot of hotspots in Syria remain. There's a kind of on and off protest movement in the Alawi community. There is the issue of Druze factionalism and separatism in Suwaida. There's the Kurdish question, and that's just talking about the peripheries of Syria and the what we call minority communities. So, but even within the Sunni, if we were to consider that the main support base of the new government, there are also open wounds and required transitional process or truth and reconciliation. So it sounds from our discussion that the politicization is papering over all these issues. One kind of evidence cited in that is that the regime is the government in Syria, the new government, is making deals with certain regime elements that were sanctioned, such as Mohammed Hamsho, and that has invited a lot of criticism. And that does also undermine the credibility of transitional justice if they're willing to do business with such figures, even if they're not necessarily military officials or so on. But still, it has damaged the credibility of this process. Would you say that's a fair assessment, that doing this kind of pragmatic approach whilst doing transitional justice could undermine the credibility of the process?
Well, firstly, they need to be seen to be doing something against the Assad regime. You know, Syria is a devastated country. It has a lot of open wounds. There's a lot of trauma in the country. People do want justice for what happened in the Assad regime years. And also, as you mentioned, the minority communities want justice for the abuses which happened to them during the coastal massacres and the Suwaida massacre. But then again, if the new government were to go after everyone who may have committed crimes under Assad's rule, it's going after a lot of people, and it will create civil unrest and sectarian unrest. I mean, we saw in protests that happened in Latakia in November or December last year, some of the Alawi protesters were calling for the release of people who had been arrested as suspects in crimes committed under the Assad regime. The world is full of bad examples of what could happen if there's, you know, kind of retributive justice after a tyrannical regime falls, like for example in Iraq.
Mm-hmm. The very bad example of de-Baathification and
yes.
how it was approached.
And you know, Sharat himself fought in Iraq against the U.S. presence there as part of the Iraqi insurgency, and that's where he became affiliated to Al-Qaeda for a while. Now, he saw for himself what happened there and how a society can break down into sectarianism. And one thing I've heard is that he wants to avoid that for Syria. If he's seen to crack down too hard on a certain community or a certain class in society, you know, that could cause problems. Now, even though we have bad examples, we do have good examples from around the world. I mean, South Africa is the
gold standard for truth and justice.
Yeah, and the thing is, over there, it was more about victim-centered justice, and this is what hasn't happened so far. Victims were offered compensation or something to acknowledge their pain and suffering, while some of the perpetrators were let go and given amnesties or lighter sentences. And you know, it's very difficult to know what to do, but this might be the best approach.
So the balance has to be between pragmatism, justice, pragmatism to preserve society, and if you do it too far, end up incarcerating most of or huge segments of society. That will not help. So it has to be pragmatic, victim-centered. That's a very good point. And not just go after a few big names and make a show, but also engage the victims. This is what we haven't seen in Syria yet, and should be the first step. The civil society, victim-centered, not necessarily importing frameworks, but consulting more the Syrian population. I think to conclude, I think on the point of bad examples and good examples, in Lebanon, there are some positives in what happened in Lebanon post-civil war. We don't want to compare too much because these are very different contexts in many ways, but also there are similarities. In Lebanon, whilst there were no trials or transitional justice as such, we had communal reconciliation that were led by communities, musalaha, especially in Mount Lebanon, al-Jabal, between Druze and Christians. So there were symbolic things like a militia that stole a church bell would return it, and they would do a ceremony about restoring the church, and they would like kind of apologize, but not without saying sorry, like in a Lebanese way, like kind of the mea culpa, but in a way like we all did bad things, we should all forgive ourselves. In a way that process is victim-centered, and there is some, you could argue there is the Druze Maronite segment of the civil war is largely forgotten.
One issue, I think, in Syria, which makes it different from Lebanon, it was always built as a kind of like the state was kind of built on the recognition that there are different communities and different religions and different sects, and politics is kind of coordinated between the sects. Now in Syria, you didn't have that. It was always papering over and not talking about differences, not even mentioning openly the fact that there are Alawis and Sunnis and Druze, and these are different sects with different beliefs and different ideas and so on. So if you want to officially recognize that in Syria now, that
also contradicts the narrative of the new identity or the new approach to building a Syrian identity, which is also kind of ignoring. It's trying to build a unitary state, no federalism. There's one Syrian identity. But that is kind of, that approach is, I think, final words to Andrea on that subject.
I was just saying it's all over social. They're trying to build that identity, but then on social media, people are completely sectarian, and the government is not doing anything to to work on that, or to restrain this sort of sectarian speech. And the social media, they're talking about, under the Assad, there was the rule of the minorities. That's the discourse for many Syrians.
I think the lesson that Syria maybe could learn from Lebanon here is that you can't impose just by talking, but just by willing it or thinking about it. You can't really impose a unitary identity on a divided context just by sheer will of power. Because Lebanon, in the Ta'if Accord, one of the elements was to develop a unified history book. So it would have unified narrative about the country, which Lebanon doesn't have. Lebanon has different histories. Each community has a history, which is kind of emerging in Syria now, where each community has a history, including of recent history, right? Not just the ancient history. And one thing the Syrian government the pitfall can avoid is not to do this approach of trying to impose one narrative or one identity with a top-bottom. It has to be bottom-up approach. It has to be through these, again, truth and justice, transitional truth and justice committees, processes, where people speak honestly about things and acknowledge the existence of division, and willing to discuss solutions like a federalism is such a dirty word in Lebanon and in Syria now. It's a big dirty word. That should be the subject of maybe a future episode, federalism in Syria, because I know also there's so many divided opinions on that. But they're not even willing to entertain the discussion of decentralization, soft federalism, because they feel this will threaten the effort to reunify Syria.
Yeah.
So we can understand what they're doing, but I think it's an open question whether this current approach can last, or it's just putting a band-aid on an open wound. Thank you all for tuning in. With that, we conclude this episode. Be sure to follow us, subscribe to this podcast, and check the show comments for links to relevant opinion articles on the subject, relevant news and analysis articles on Syria, a very watched subject by the New Arab. Thank you all.